Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. It was one of those pale London mornings when the city seemed to be struggling to find its colour, and even the hansoms clatter with a hushed reserve. The fog had lifted, but it would not leave the streets. It lingered in webs around lampposts and crept, thread-like, along the eaves. I had breakfasted with Holmes at Baker Street, and was debating the relative merits of trout fly patterns, when he, who was stretched out on the settee with his violin across his knees, gave a little chuckle and pointed the bow toward the door. "Your patient is late, Watson," he remarked, "and the gentleman for whom you will now relinquish that wonderful chair made the wrong turn at Marylebone Lane due to a costermonger's overturned barrow. He will smell like bruised apples." "You are in good spirits this morning," I replied, smiling despite myself. "But I confess I expect no patient." "No, but you expect a bill," he said, indicating with the tip of his bow a small smudge on my left cuff. "The blue chalk of a chemist's tally, picked up when you paid for the tincture yesterday. Your landlord has a headache. She sent you after laudanum with the intention of using it tonight if required. But the label was changed at your request to 5 drops every 4 hours, which is the practice of a man who values sleep above caution. It doesn't matter because the druggist knows you and diluted the laudanum." I had no time to protest his liberties on my conscience, for the bell rang in the hall, and after a word with Mrs. Hudson, the door opened to reveal Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, brisk in a dark ulster, and behind him a lady in travel-worn mourning. Her hands clenched on a small reticule as if it contained a heart rather than a purse. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade remarked with a half-salute, half-surrender nod. "I would not have disturbed you so early if it were not a nasty business. Mrs. Ainsworth from Fern Lodge." "On the heath," the lady stepped forward. "Beatrice Ainsworth," she began, in a voice that had tried for hours to remain calm but was suddenly failing. "My husband has died, Mr. Holmes. He was found this morning in his private workspace. The door was locked from the inside." Oh, merciful heavens, the window. Holmes had risen and set down the violin with the tenderness he rarely showed to live things. "Pray sit, madam," he urged in that kind tone that never failed to amaze me when it came as readily from him as his harder notes. "You came in your carriage from Hampstead, not by train. I noticed the mud of the bridle road on your hem, and the straw seed caught in it suggests the mews of a private stable. Tea, Watson. And if you're here, Inspector, it's because the yard is confused. You will spare me your synopsis. Mrs. Ainsworth will tell it." "What about the window?" "It was the nursery window," she muttered, clutching the reticule so firmly that the metal clasp dug into her gloveless fingers. "It overlooks the east garden, and at dawn the housemaid drew back the blinds to air the room," she yelled. "There was a face at the glass." "A face," I repeated, involuntarily staring at our own fog-dim windows. "A face on the outside of the glass," Lestrade continued, continuing the story with a dry professional impatience that couldn't hide his agitation. "At the 3rd story. She swears on it. Furthermore, there are stains where breath, or something like breath, clouded the pane, as well as a mark where a human hand, or something like a hand, pressed against it. But there's nothing below. No ladder, no tracks in the frost-silvered mould, no ivy strong enough to support a cat. And darn it, the window is latched inside." Holmes's eyes had lit up with the interior light that his bloodless visage served as a lamp. "You're interesting to me," he said quietly. "And Mr. Ainsworth?" Mrs. Ainsworth's lips twitched. "Percival. He was a civil engineer, Mr. Holmes, with contracts for the new railway cuttings. He had a little room adjoining the nursery for his drawings and instruments. He worked until late last night," she swallowed. "He did not come to bed. Found how?" "In his chair, his head was bowed on the table." The door was locked. The key was in the lock on the inside. The window latches. The chimney too narrow. There was a strong smell of spirits. His hand was clasped around his pen. There was... Her composure finally snapped. There was a look upon his face that I can never forget. Lestrade intervened, perhaps to protect her. "The doctor says it's apoplexy." "I say not. There is a discoloration, a streak in the corner of the mouth and a strange tightness of the jaw on the left that reminds me of, well, something else. Of strychnine? I took a chance. Not unless strychnine has taken to leaving a sweetish scent, Lestrade told me. There was an aroma in the room that wasn't just from spirit. The maid mentions carbolic. The gardener says tar. I say I don't know. But I know this. A groom on his way to the stables at dawn swears he saw a pale face in the nursery window for a moment against the rising light, a face that gazed down on him with eyes as lifeless as a doll, then vanished. Holmes raised his fingers and looked up at the ceiling, as if it were a checkerboard made of plaster. Mrs. Ainsworth, he explained, your husband had enemies. Do not spare me. We all have enemies, Mr. Holmes, though we never think so, she said, the words weary rather than spiteful. He fired our gardener, Thomas Pike, a fortnight ago for drunkenness and insolence. Mr. Julian Crowther, a former partner in a small surveying firm, filed a chancery suit and lost. She paused. There's my cousin, Mr. Lionel Hartley, who has been our guest for 3 weeks. He and Percival, oh, it is awful to speak of it, had words yesterday morning on a thing I must not discuss. Holmes's previously faraway stare returned to her with unexpected clarity. Must not, or dare not? He asked, softening as he saw the tears well up. Forgive me. We will not force a locked drawer while the key may yet be found in a more honourable location. Mrs. Ainsworth has given us leave, continued Lestrade, and I have a cab waiting at the door. If you would come, Mr. Holmes. Holmes took up his ulster and proceeded to wear it with the economy of motion that gave him the appearance of an instrument extended by the mind rather than the body when he was busy. As he did so, his hawk-like gaze rested on a little smudge on the strap of Mrs. Ainsworth's reticule. May I? He asked, and when she nodded he stroked it with the tip of a long finger before raising it to his nostrils. Iodoform, he whispered quietly to himself. There was a sprinkling of blue on the leather nearby. Not the blue of ladies' powder, but rather the stain of draftsman's chalk. You have touched your husband's instruments this morning, madam. I fetched his case-book for Inspector Lestrade, she exclaimed. Exactly so. Watson, your hat. The air on the heath will be healthier for your lungs and my reasoning. Within 10 minutes we were rolling through the waking city, past milk carts and yawning apprentices, past gentlemen with their collars lifted to their ears, and errand boys blowing steam upon their fingers. Holmes sat forward, his angular profile contrasting with the glass like a cameo. Without looking at me, he replied, You noticed the inspector mentioned a sweetish scent. Do you remember, Watson, the case of the retired tanner in Bermondsey and the varnisher's apprentice? Ether, I answered. And then, patience, he whispered. So far we have a dead engineer in a locked room, a face at a third-floor window, strange breath marks on glass, frost without footprints, and a household whose relations are politely concealed. We are offered the common coinage of superstition, and I am to give the shopman's gaze to see whether it is counterfeit. There is also the nursery, always a strange corner of any house, where love and dread coexist behind painted paper. At Hampstead, the sky had changed from pearl to weak gold, as if someone had breathed on the horizon, warming it slightly. Fern Lodge was a bit off the road, a clean, modern house with a grey stone foundation and pale brick top stories with narrow and tall windows. It would have looked cheery on a June afternoon. That morning it carried itself like a lady at a funeral, upright, composed but with something battling in the throat. A parlour-maid with red eyes and an askew apron welcomed us and led us to a drawing-room with a fire that had been pushed past its natural temperature. Mrs. Ainsworth's cousin, Mr. Lionel Hartley, was present, an elegant, nervous young man with the kind of charm one expects to see in Italian portraits, too polished by half for the English environment. He began when we entered and then bowed. Mr. Holmes, he murmured, with a studied ease that did not quite conceal the trembling on his lip. This is a terrible morning. Poor Beatrice, she is with the housekeeping. If I can be of service, later, Holmes said, almost amicably. We shall begin at the nursery. Lestrade led the way up a staircase that turned twice and opened onto a large landing. The nursery door remained open. Beyond it, a room lay in icy order, the fire unlit, the toys, few and old, arranged on a shelf, and a painted rocking horse looking at us with foolish solemnity. The eastern window overlooked the garden, where frost lay in a sparkling film over the cabbages and stiff grass. Holmes walked straight to the window and stood against the light. There was a faint ghost of a shape on the inner surface of the glass, an oval, fuzzy, as if a chilly face had pressed itself against the window. Two darker circles, possibly eye hollows, characterized its upper section, with a smear to the side that could have been the drag of a hand. Holmes bent near, so close that for a heartbeat, his own ascetic visage looked to meld with that faint suggestion, and then, with a rapid delicacy, took a lens from his pocket lining and studied the bottom corner. "Watson," he whispered. "Your hand." I offered it, and he directed my finger to a little crust at the sash's edge, a bead so minuscule that I should never have spotted. I touched it and moved it aside with my finger and thumb. It broke, leaving a faint tackiness and a faint scent, not quite sweet, not quite chemical, that reminded me of hospitals and the floor of a painter's shop. "What do you make of that?" replied Lestrade, craning. "I make of it," Holmes continued abstractly, "that we are to be very careful where we put our hands." He focused his attention on the sill, dragging a fingernail along a groove. Clean, too clean. And yet, what is cleanliness if not the remembrance of dirt? He moved to the adjacent door, which was closed, and studied the keyhole. A particle of blue powder sat on the rim, like a star dropped into a thimble. He grinned, and there was nothing pleasant about it. "Inspector," said the officer, "you shall first show me Mr. Ainsworth." Lestrade guided us into the small workroom that communicates with the nursery, which was unlocked from within by the unfortunate means of a table knife at the hinge, as I deduced from his scowl. Mr. Percival Ainsworth lay as described, his head sunk forward on a pile of papers, his right fist gripped around a pen, whose tip had etched a violent black star on the page. The air conveyed the heavy breath of alcohol, yet beneath it, yes, there was the same equivocal fragrance I had detected at the window, and another fainter, as of metal newly filed. Holmes did not immediately approach the body. He proceeded first to the grate, where a small amount of ash was carefully arranged, and then to the wastebasket, where a scrap of blue rope coiled like a dead worm. Then, with a deftness that always amazed me at the contradiction between those long, bony hands and their softness, he lifted Mr. Ainsworth's head and, with my help, made such observations as a physician's training would allow. "You see, Lestrade," he murmured, "the muscular set about the jaw, the unique flattening of the tongue, the tightness in the fingers, our doctor's apoplexy cannot account for these. And now on the cuff, what say you about that, Watson? Trace of pitch? No varnish," I said, sniffling. "Shellac? Near enough for government work," Holmes remarked, amused. He straightened, his gaze returning to the window separating the rooms. Her face at the glass at dawn. "A man is dead behind a locked door, a smear where a hand should not be, and cleanliness where dust should prevail. Inspector, I suppose your spirit is mortal, which is a pity for the newspapers and a comfort for the rest of us." He turned, and from the passage came a suppressed gasp, swiftly smothered. Holmes was on the threshold in 2 strides. The tunnel was empty, save for a draught that conveyed faintly the aroma we had already encountered twice that morning. Holmes peered back at us over his shoulder, his eyes bright. "We shall have our hands full, gentlemen," he told them. "And if we are fortunate, we will have them full before the sun has completely cleared the garden. Come on, let us start at the bottom of the stairs." Holmes descended with a long, noiseless stride that reminded me of a bird making its way through reeds. The warmth of the overheated drawing-room gave way to the colder currents of the service passage, which smelled of wet stone, detergent, and yesterday's onion. A heavy woman in a black alpaca gown greeted us at the turn, her respectable figure kept together, as much by will as by whalebone. She dropped a bob that was almost a curtsy, and wrung her hands without making them appear to ring. "Mrs. Greeley, housekeeper," Lestrade said. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Her eyes, tiny and shrewd as currants in sweet, drew us in. "If you please, sirs, the young mistress begs that we do not upset the children." "There are children," remarked Holmes. "2 small children, a boy and a girl. They sleep in the nursery next to—" She paused as if the word itself could awaken the dead. Annie, the housemaid, pulled the blinds. "She is in the scullery, if you must. She is barely fit to speak." "We shall not press where silence is more instructive," Holmes replied with an unusual gentleness. "However, one eyelash can sometimes reveal the truth when the tongue cannot. If you'll let me take a tour of your territory." He didn't wait for permission. The scullery lay beyond, its slate sink stained white with lye, and tin pans lined the wall like shields. A thin, freckled girl with swollen eyelids stood beside a pail. She gripped a damp cloth like a talisman, and I noticed her right thumb was wrapped with a yellow-dusted rag. Iodoform, Holmes whispered, casting a glance at the thumb bucket and the dark splash on the floor. He pulled off the dresser a bottle, held it to his nose and set it down again. Carbolic. Annie, you have been brave. Tell us exactly what you saw. Her words came quickly, tripping over themselves. It was early, sir. The lamps were turned out, and there was a strange glow that was neither day nor night. I drew the blind to shake the frost off the pane, for Mrs. Greeley says it marks the lace if you leave it, and there it was, as big as life, a face, white as a turnip, with pit-like eyes. It was jammed against the glass, sir. I yelled, and when I looked back it was gone. Pressed. How? Holmes's tone was gentle, as if he were questioning a sleepwalker. Flat, sir, as if a dead man had been placed outside. There was a breath. She put a hand to her own mouth in a gesture that made me tremble, as if to push back a breath that was not her own. Missed. And a hand there too, along with it. Holmes tilted his head. And below the window, did you run to look? I did not stir from the spot, sir. Not if the house had burned to the ground. Mrs. Greeley presented a motion of approval that contained the entire gospel of domestic order. Holmes walked by them to the outer door. The yard transformed into a winter garden, a rectangle of ironed grass, a cooking plot rimmed with sugared pastry, and a gravel road leading stiffly to the stable arch. The air nipped at one's teeth. He stood on the doorstep, hands in his pockets, his face elevated. Third story, he whispered quietly to himself. The east wall has no ivy, and the brickwork is new and tight. A ladder? He turned and looked at the stable boy, a square youth with handle-like ears who lingered guiltily in the arch. You're my boy. Name? Willie, sir. Willie, how many ladders have you at Fern Lodge? One long for the cherries, sir, and a painter's step-ladder. What, Mr. Pike? He paused, shooting a terrified look at the housekeeper. What Mr. Pike borrowed, Holmes explained, as if sparing the boy the sin of finishing the sentence. And did he return it? Mrs. Greeley stiffened. Thomas Pike is no longer in this house. So I understand. Holmes was already walking, so we followed him. He paced from the stable to the east wall, then from the wall to the flower bed beneath the nursery. The gravel lay as neatly as a churchgoer's conscience, and the frost on the bed was a beautiful hard crust, unmarked by even the brush of a bird's wing. What say you, Lestrade? Inquired Holmes. Lestrade, who had his collar up and his cynicism buttoned within, was relieved to have found something substantial. No man went up that wall last night. No man in boots, Holmes concurred. His gaze fell to the brickwork. He ran his finger lightly over the stretcher course beneath the nursery. The skin creaked on the ice. He stooped in the left-hand corner, where the sash met the stone band. I saw his nail pick very gently, at the smallest pimple of substance, another of the tiny beads of sticky matter he had shown me before. Resin, I suggested. I fear so. And there is a thin powder on the lower ashlar. Watson, your lens? I handed it over. Through the circle of glass, the commonplace brick took on character. Along its face, a light blue bloom lay, as if a butterfly had rested there and flown. Holmes touched the spot with his forefinger and rubbed it on his thumb. Prussian blue, he stated. A draftsman's companion. And here, he straightened, his gaze shifting from the height of the wall to the invisible geometry of the air. A line was cast last evening, Inspector, and it snapped clean. You're familiar with the builder's trick. Stretch and twang a blue-rubbed string to indicate a straight course on rough material. However, there is another application, transmitting motion along a line with the least amount of weight. Lestrade sniffed. Do you mean to hang a man on a thread? Not to hang him, says Holmes, but to irritate an obstinate piece of iron from a distance. He turned back into the house so quickly that the stable boy nearly fell over himself in his effort to escape him. Holmes returned to the nursery and inspected. The sash, like a watchmaker, reads a watch. He ran his nail along the meeting rail, then into the side groove. Cleaner than a child's conscience, he whispered. And yet here on the bottom bead, yes, there is grit where grit ought not to be in a room where Mrs. Greeley rules. He opened and closed his mouth before crossing inside the workroom where the engineer had died. There his motions became more quick, but never irresponsible. He knelt by the grate, took one glittering particle off the ash cone and placed it on his palm. It glistened like fish scales. Varnish burnt to glass, he explained. Shellac, perhaps, and he had his head in the wastebasket and emerged with that loop of blue thread I had seen earlier, now longer by a foot, where he had teased a knot loose. The same color as the flower on the brick. The same dust on the keyhole rim, too. He lifted and twisted the key. A stiff movement. Feel, Watson. There is an unevenness. I tried it. As if something had been tied to it. Quite right. A cord on a key, glue on a sash, a breath on a window at dawn. Our ghost is active. He gazed at the table instead of the dead guy, at a corner where the polish had been smeared to dullness. He smelled. Canada balsam, he murmured with pleasure. There's also a whiff of turpentine oil. Your husband was an engineer, madam, he called, for Mrs. Ainsworth had appeared timidly at the threshold. But he had of late been meddling with optics. Optics, she repeated, bewildered. Lenses, slides, and glasses that show what is not in front of them, Holmes replied abstractly. He may have had a taste for fashionable lantern entertainments. That is not a crime. You will provide me, lady, with the key to any cupboard or chest where Mr. Ainsworth stored instruments unrelated to his railway business, she faltered. He kept a small mahogany case, Mr. Holmes, in the closet by the writing desk. I do not, Mrs. Greeley, Holmes stated calmly. You have the household keys. The housekeeper created with the seriousness of a ritual, a ring strong enough to secure a jail. Holmes attempted 3 before one slipped home with a tiny definitive click. A brass-mounted tube, a box of glass plates wrapped in tissue, a bottle labelled in Mr. Ainsworth's hand, balsam, and nested in cotton a thin oval of something like horn, no, glass, matted at the edges with a gummy brown. Upon that oval a terrible pale countenance glimmered, as if a face had been caught there like a fly in amber. Mrs. Ainsworth made a sound and shrank back. Holmes did not lift the thing. He just contemplated it with that dry serenity of his which, to those who did not know him, might have passed for want of feeling. Watson, he added quietly, make a note of this. A photographic transparency of a human face, bonded with balsam to a thin guard, the edge rimmed with resin to keep. Inspector, do you see how a child's dread may be marshaled like troops? But the question isn't why a phantom was created, but who held the string. We will speak with the groom who saw this apparition from below, as well as Mr. Lionel Hartley, about the words exchanged yesterday morning. He closed the closet and handed back the key with a bow that made Mrs. Greeley blink. And then, if you please, we shall take the air upon the roof. Lestrade reacted to Holmes's proposal to ascend the roof with the same half-skeptical, half-resigned expression I had seen on the inspector's face many times before, as if he had already anticipated being led through some tortuous line of reasoning that would end, despite his best efforts, with results he could neither dispute nor achieve. Mrs. Ainsworth, evidently uneasy, excused herself with a tremulous tilt of her head, leaving Mrs. Greeley to guide us through the top passages. We climbed narrow steps to the garret level, where the air was harsher and filled with the draughts that circulate through attics and half-used corridors. The trap to the roof opened with surprising ease beneath Holmes's touch, and we were standing on the leads in the cold morning light. The house's chimneys loomed around us like sentinels, their tops already glittering where frost had surrendered to the rising sun. Holmes went quickly to the eastern edge, his gaze surveying the grounds below with a unique intensity that appeared to transmit not just sight, but also thinking outward, as if pressing the environment to reveal its mysteries. You'll see, Watson, he remarked, crouching by the parapet, that the gutter has a residue unrelated to its function. Do you notice this tackiness on the metal? Here's resin again, fresh and unweathered, with a thin strand sticking to the edge. With his tweezers he dragged out a filament so fine it might have been horsehair. Against the light it glistened blue. Prussian blue dust ground into the twist, Holmes added. This is no accident of color, but the deliberate preparation of a cord rubbed and strung with pigment. Such a line might be flung from above, drawn taut and snapped precisely. Observe the angle, direct to the nursery sash, Lestrade murmured. So you believe the fellow let down his line from here, made mischief with the glass, and then pulled up without hitting the ground? It's fantastic, Holmes. Fanciful only until we recall that Mr. Ainsworth was an engineer. He, more than most, would understand the physics of lines, weights, and pulleys. But the situation is not that straightforward. Inspector, look at the face. It did not float down of its own accord. It was fabricated, attached, possibly even projected by a device. Mr. Watson, think about the transparency we've previously studied. I shuddered slightly in the wind that swept across the roof, but my thoughts followed his. The ghastly visage cemented on glass. It could be fastened at the end of such a cord, lowered before the pane and withdrawn again without trace. Holmes' eyes glittered. Precisely. A phantasm for the maid and a diversion for the family. And while their attention was focused on superstition, a murder, or something resembling murder, was committed alongside it. He walked the length of the parapet, stopping to look down over the north side, where ivy clung in a sparse riband. He folded his arms with satisfaction. Enough. We have an outline of the procedure. What remains is the motive, and the hand that set this pantomime into action. We returned below, and Holmes immediately wanted to see the groom who claimed to have witnessed the apparition. The man, a broad-shouldered person with worn skin, was led from the stable. He removed his cap and shuffled uncomfortably across the carpet of the morning room where we gathered. "Your name?" Holmes inquired. "Carter, sir." "I am William Carter." "You were abroad in the garden at daybreak?" "Yes, sir. I had a call from the mare. She had a restless night as the frost set in. I was walking to the stable when I looked up." He broke off, swallowing. "I saw it plainly, sir. A face in the nursery window, white as linen, looked down at me. No features, I swear, but the eyes, Lord, the eyes." Holmes eyed him with a keen calm. "How long did you observe it?" "It is not the turn of a minute, sir, a blink like," I yelled, believing a thief was nearby. "Then it was gone. You are a sober man, Carter." "As sober as they get, sir." "Ask anyone." Holmes nodded. "Thank you, that's all. Inspector, we must not disregard the fellow's evidence, for it corroborates the maid's. But observe, Watson, how fleeting was the apparition, enough to sow panic, not to satisfy investigation. The equipment was never designed to withstand scrutiny. Lionel Hartley walked in, his shined boots clicking faintly on the boards. He nodded politely, but his gaze shifted rapidly to Lestrade and then Holmes, as if calculating how much each man had already divined. "You wish to speak with me, Mr. Holmes?" His speech was smooth and cultured, yet I noticed a tiny tremble in the undercurrent. "Indeed. You and Mr. Ainsworth spoke yesterday, right?" Hartley colored slightly. "We did. A trifling matter between gentlemen. It makes no difference today." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "the smallest quarrel is magnified when one party dies within a day." "Please be candid." Hartley took a breath and straightened his tie. "My cousin Beatrice's husband had promised to support my investment. When he declined at the 11th hour, I spoke strongly. That is all." Holmes's stare was fastened upon him with disturbing persistence. "Investment in what?" "In a shipping venture," Hartley replied, his words too quick as if rehearsed. Holmes tilted his head but said nothing else. Lestrade, however, replied, "And where were you last night, sir?" "I am in my chambers. Mrs. Greeley will testify that she brought me hot water at 10:30, and I did not stir again." The housekeeper verified this with a polite nod. Without comment, Holmes turned to the table containing the engineer's drawings. He lifted a sheet at random, held it up to the light, and then spoke quietly and authoritatively. "We have not yet reached the heart of this, but we get closer. Mr. Ainsworth experimented with optical devices, and he died last night with resin, shellac, and blue dust on him. He argued with his wife's relatives, fired a drunken gardener, and had a former partner soured by the law. 3 paths of inquiry are accessible to us. Which will we follow?" He looked at Lestrade with a hint of challenge. The inspector smelled. "I will start with Pike, the gardener. The aggressive individual known to the yard. If any individual returned here at night to terrorize the house and exact revenge, it is he." Holmes's lips twisted in an amused expression. "Really good. Pursue Pike by any means. Meanwhile, Watson, we'll focus on the dead man's equipment and the blue-stained cable. The truth is not in a drunken grudge, but in a mind equal to Ainsworth's. There is a hand here, Inspector, subtle enough to conjure phantoms and lock doors without leaving a footprint in the frost. That hand we must discover." His eyes were filled with that distinct fire that I knew so well. For me, the case had already expanded into a labyrinth, but for Holmes it had become, undeniably, a game of the keenest fascination. Holmes bent over the late engineer's table once again, his long fingers neatly arranging the plans and tools. but his eyes looked riveted beyond them, as if the pattern he sought was suspended in the air rather than on the paper. I recognized that expression. It indicated that the case was resolving in his mind, albeit not in such a way that he would allow speaking. Lestrade, restless as always when Holmes was silent, murmured about summoning men to search Hampstead for the discharged gardener, Pike, and dashed for the door. Holmes halted him with a subtle gesture. "Just a moment, Inspector. Before you waste the Yard's resources on a wild chase, please let me ask Mrs. Ainsworth one more question." She walked in almost immediately, pale but composed, as if Holmes's summons had been delivered to her through the walls. Her dark outfit, still crumpled from hasty travel, looked to swallow her form, yet her gaze held a steady courage. "Madam," remarked Holmes gently, "your husband's interest in optics, was this recent?" She paused. "It happened within the past year. He attended seminars at the Polytechnic and bought equipment. I assumed it was a harmless diversion, but he stayed late at his bench. He said it eased his mind from the burden of calculations." Holmes tilted his head. "And this Mr. Crowther, his former partner, did he share such interests?" She squeezed her lips together. "I could not say. I haven't seen Mr. Crowther in years. He bore Percival a grudge, definitely, but whether his pursuits touched on science I do not know." "Quite so," Holmes murmured, but I could tell he was taking her words very seriously. "You have been most helpful." When she left, he turned quickly to us. "Watson, observe. A railway engineer engrossed with optical devices, arguing with old and new companions. His death is staged as apoplexy, but it has the hallmarks of interference: resin, varnish, sweet fragrance, and a shut door. The apparition at the window acts as a smokescreen, both literally and metaphorically." Lestrade made a snort of impatience. "And what about the cousin, Hartley? You cannot ignore that he has words, nor that he profits if money is released." "Yes, Inspector, he profits in theory. However, his way of life suggests that he is a dilettante rather than a creator of ghostly illusions. No, our offender must be both inventive and practical, with understanding of chemical varnishes, resins, and line. He must have once shared Mr. Ainsworth's universe." Holmes' eyes glittered. "It is Crowther who interests me most." We exited the workroom and walked along the hallway, where a shaft of frigid sunlight pierced the glass above the door. Holmes paused abruptly, stooping to pick up a little speck of hardened stuff from the carpet. He touched it to his tongue, scowled, and pocketed it. "Another trace of resin, Watson," he murmured. "But here, away from the workshop. Why? Unless—" He paused, his gaze narrowing. "Come, I'd like to inspect the lock on the front door." The housekeeper retrieved the key ring once more. Holmes inspected the massive brass lock with a lens and a nail. "You see? Particles inside the wards. Resin was applied to a wire and strengthened to allow for external manipulation of the bolt. We must not suppose the house impregnable. Someone entered and left with preparation." We followed him out. The frost was softening as the sun rose, but enough remained to preserve impressions. Holmes prowled along the gravel, then out upon the road, where wheels had damaged the surface. He crouched by one print and measured it against his hand. A taxi stopped here in the early hours. The horse stood long enough to claw the frost into this hole. Note the tread of the wheel. It is nicked onto the rim. I've seen such a cab previously, Watson, standing for hire near Euston Square. He stood, dusting his knees. "Lestrade, we need to track that cab. The driver may remember his fare." It was planned that the inspector would dispatch a constable to the cab stand. Meanwhile, Holmes insisted that we accompany him back inside, as he had not finished with the instruments. In the workshop, he reopened the mahogany cabinet and meticulously arranged each item. When the brass tube was moved, it revealed a modestly powered magic lantern projector. When brought up to light, the wrapped slides revealed faint silhouettes of faces. One, unwrapped, revealed unmistakably the visage we had seen in the nursery transparency, a terrible, pallid countenance with eyes sunken by shadow. Holmes inserted the slide into the projector, lit a lamp, and hurled the awful face against the wall. Despite knowing its origin, I admit a shiver ran down my spine. You can see, Watson, how this sight would frighten the unwary from a close distance or against a misted pane. Mr. Ainsworth indulged in such amusements. but who, last night, used his harmless ruse for nefarious purposes. At that moment, Lionel Hartley reappeared, his appearance composed but his words tinged with reproach. "Is it essential, Mr. Holmes, to scare the family further with these gruesome displays? My relative is scarcely chilly in death, and yet his goods are presented like a showman's tricks." Holmes regarded him coldly. "Sir, the truth can be a gruesome exhibitor. Do you deny knowledge of these instruments?" Hartley stretched his hands. "I had never seen them before this morning. Percival said little to me about his hobbies." Holmes did not respond, but when Hartley withdrew again, he said to me in a low tone, "See how he separates himself too quickly. He is afraid of being implicated, but he protests his ignorance excessively. Still, I feel his guilt does not stem from the hand that created the phantoms." A knock interrupted us. A cop had returned with news. A cab driver at Euston recalled transporting a gentleman to Hampstead at midnight. He characterized him as middle-aged and of substantial frame, wearing a muffler up high and a travel bag on his knee. The cab had waited a few minutes at Fern Lodge before returning. "Crowther," Holmes replied quietly, as if to himself. "Yes, Crowther." Lestrade straightened eagerly. "Then by thunder we have him." "I will issue a warrant." Holmes raised a hand. "Be patient, Inspector. Circumstance alone will not suffice. We must set a more subtle trap, for this man is not a common ruffian, but he possesses a mind equal to Ainsworth's. Give him rope and he'll tangle himself." He turned to face me, his eyes filled with that savage excitement that I had come to fear as much as admire. "Watson, tonight we will keep vigil at Fern Lodge. Our foe isn't finished yet. If he comes, once to create faces at dawn, he will return to polish his creation. And when he does," he snapped the lamp shut decisively, "we shall be waiting." Holmes's declaration that we would keep a vigil seemed to electrify the atmosphere at Fern Lodge. Lestrade murmured something about the difficulty of night watching, but I knew the inspector too well to believe he'd leave the field when Holmes sniffed his target. Mrs. Ainsworth glanced at Holmes with a mixture of thankfulness and dread, as if the promise of discovery brought with it a new evil. As evening approached, the household fell into a tight silence. Fires were lighted in the lower apartments, but despite the light, a chill persisted in the hallways. Holmes occupied himself by perusing the deceased man's papers, with an attention so total that I doubted if he was cognizant of the tea that Mrs. Greeley brought. I watched the firelight flicker over his gaunt features, and knew that beneath the silence, his mind was whirling with calculations and comparisons that frequently resulted in a quick flame of triumph. As the last colors of the sky faded and the lamps along the road were turned on, Holmes rose and summoned me to the stairwell. "Watson," he added in a quiet but lively voice, "I've analyzed every strand of this web. There is design here, yet the hand that created it can't stop weaving. Tonight we shall place ourselves so as to observe without being observed. Bring your gun, though I hope it will not be needed." Lestrade joined us, his boots squeaking on the landing. "And what role am I to play in this little drama, Mr. Holmes?" he inquired with his usual dryness. "You, Inspector, will remain with Mrs. Ainsworth and the servants, keeping them to their rooms. We must reduce the variables. Watson and I will hide near the nursery and watch for a repeat of yesterday night's event." He brought me to a little cupboard that opened into the corridor, immediately opposite the nursery. Its door was equipped with a small grating for ventilation. From this vantage, we could command a partial view of the landing and, through a gap, the black square of the nursery window. The air inside was musty from disuse, and our breath steamed faintly in the enclosed space. Holmes sat down like a bird of prey on a branch, his long arms folded and his gaze fixed. The hours dragged. The creak of the old house, the muffled sounds of servants, and the restless cry of a kid were all heard from below. Midnight tolled from a faraway church, deepening the silence. My eyelids drooped, but Holmes remained motionless, only inclining his head once toward the window. I followed his gaze and began. Against the pale glow of moonlight, the nursery window appeared to quiver, as if mist had gathered on it from outside. A shape revealed itself, ghastly, pale, a face suspended in the night. Its features were indistinct, yet the hollow sockets where eyes should have been stabbed, the heart with chill. For a brief moment, I believed that an apparition had materialized. Then Holmes's hand closed like iron on my wrist, anchoring me to reality. "There," he muttered, "the trick resumes." The phantom moved slightly and then pressed closer, leaving a tiny film of breath on the glass. I heard a gasp from the corridor, perhaps from housemaid Annie, who was sneaking out of her chamber contrary orders, but Holmes smothered the sound by tightening his grip. He carefully pushed the closet door open and moved into the landing's shade. I followed, gun in hand, my pulse thumping. Holmes sank to one knee beside the skirting and ran his fingers down the seam. In the moonlight, I spotted what he was looking for, a delicate, taut, trembling line stretching from the window and disappearing upward. He swiftly snatched it between his finger and thumb, producing a little blade. The connection snapped with the faintest whisper, and instantaneously, the face at the window jerked, swung sideways, and disappeared into the night. A sound followed, an exclamation stifled in the throat, and then the distinct scrape of hurried feet on the roof above. Holmes darted toward the attic stairs, and I followed him. We climbed like men pursued, the boards creaking under our weight until we emerged into the cold draft of the garret. The trap to the roof was stirring. Someone had opened it and was dragging himself through. "Stop there!" I cried as I leveled my revolver. But Holmes was quicker. With a bound, he seized the intruder's boot, and the man toppled back into the garret with a cry. He was stout, middle-aged, and muffled in a heavy coat. When he turned toward us, his face was familiar from the description. Julian Crowther. He struggled violently, but Holmes had the strength of wire and sinew, and in a matter of moments, the fellow was tied by his own string. His eyes flashed with mingled rage and dread. "So, Mr. Crowther," Holmes explained calmly, "you returned to your former partner's house to finish your pantomime. You considered terrifying the household with a phantom while looking for something more substantial. Perhaps the plans upon his desk, or the notes in his private journal." Crowther spat on the floor. "You have no proof." "A man may walk on a house's roof if he wishes." Holmes grinned thinly. "When he carries a lantern slide, a vial of resin, and a cord dusted with Prussian blue, the yard will call it more than a stroll." Lestrade burst in at that time, summoned by Annie's terrified screams. His face brightened with professional joy when he spotted the hostage. "By thunder, Holmes, you've netted him." "So it was Crowther all along." Holmes lifted his hand. "Be gentle, Inspector. True, we caught him in the act, but the bigger question is, what was he trying to conceal? Ainsworth is dead, not merely afraid. Crowther's trickery explains the phantom, but not the deadly seizure. That is the heart of our investigation." He bent over the bound man, his voice hardening. "You can talk now or wait until evidence rises against you. In either case, we'll find out what happened between you and your ex-partner last night. Did you meet him in his workspace? Did you interfere with his sketches? Or did your disagreement extend beyond business?" Crowther's lips tightened and he turned his face away. Holmes straightened, his eyes filled with the interior fire I'd seen at so many turning points. "Watson," he replied, "we have caught the mischief-maker, but not the murderer. Crowther has given us half of the story. Tomorrow we shall compel the other half by examining what Mr. Ainsworth left behind, not merely in his instruments but in his very flesh. A post-mortem will reveal what his quiet lips cannot. Until then, keep your revolver handy, since even though our phantom has been apprehended, the genuine shadow still hangs over Fern Lodge." The morning after Crowther's capture dawned, with a weak sun filtering through the mists of Hampstead. The house stood in a weird calm, as though every beam and joist were listening for what would come of the happenings of the night. Mrs. Ainsworth remained in her chamber, sending word through Mrs. Greeley that she could not face another interview until she had regained her strength. Lestrade, on the other hand, was overjoyed, and couldn't stop himself from pacing the hall like a sentry, ready to march his prisoner to the yard. Holmes, however, detained him. "You may remove Mr. Crowther immediately, Inspector, but not until we are satisfied that the cause of Ainsworth's death is more than a quarrel and a phantasmagoria. The post-mortem must precede any conclusions." "Always delaying the obvious, Holmes," Lestrade grumbled. "We catch the man on the roof with his devil's toys and a cord in his pocket, and you still ask for more evidence. A jury would need no more." Holmes looked at him with a thin smile. "Truth is not the same as a jury. Crowther may have committed a conspiracy, but blaming him for a murder by apoplexy is like confusing the shadow with the object. Watson, we shall attend the examination ourselves." Arrangements were arranged quickly, and within 2 hours I was standing beside Holmes in the frigid mortuary chamber at Hampstead Hospital. The surgeon in charge, a sprightly man named Dr. Galbraith, welcomed us with the attitude of someone who indulges an oddball at no great cost. "Apoplexy?" he inquired, looking at the papers on his desk. That was the family physician's opinion. I realized the appearance of the face was strange, but such things do happen. "Indulge me with particular care, doctor," Holmes replied. "I seek not what is usual, but what is singular." Percival Ainsworth's body lay on the table, pallid and hard. I steeled myself, for though accustomed to such scenes in my military practice, there was a peculiar sadness in seeing this domestic tragedy laid bare under the clinical lamp. Galbraith approached his work methodically, observing the clenched jaw, arched back, and constricted fists. I leaned closer, my physician's eye recalling the symptoms I had seen before. "Convulsions," I said to Holmes. "Not apoplexy, poison." "Precisely," Holmes muttered back. Galbraith looked up. "You're correct. Strychnine can be identified by muscle rigidity, a rhesus sardonicus around the mouth, and lividity. The stomach contents corroborate it. There's no doubt the man was poisoned." Lestrade, who had followed reluctantly, made a start. "Poison, is it?" Then Crowther's deceit was but a sideshow. "More than a sideshow," Holmes corrected. It was the curtain raised to conceal the true drama. While the household's attention was diverted by a phantom at the nursery window, Ainsworth sat in his workroom, dying from strychnine. "But who administered it?" I asked. "Would he not have tasted the bitterness?" "Not if it were disguised," Holmes said, his brows narrowing. "Remember the scent in the chamber, the spirits, the varnish, and the sweetish odor. A carefully crafted drink may disguise the poison until it's too late. Crowther's presence on the roof is undeniable, but whether he carried the draught himself or someone else placed it at Ainsworth's elbow needs to be determined." We returned to Fern Lodge with this awful realization weighing over us. Holmes returned to the workroom, where the papers remained undisturbed. He studied the glasses upon the table, lifting one to his nose. "Smell, Watson. Do you detect it?" I inhaled again, catching that faint, sickly fragrance. "Yes." This glass contained the fatal draught. Holmes laid it down with care. "Note, however, that the residue is slight. The vast majority was consumed." Ainsworth assumed he was sipping his own cordial, possibly laced with spirits for the night's labor. Someone had prepared it for him, or tampered with his own bottle. "We need to know who had access." At that moment, Lionel Hartley entered, pallid from a night of anxiety. He started to notice us bent over the table. "Still probing, Mr. Holmes? Surely the arrest of Crowther ends this awful affair." "On the contrary," Holmes responded coldly, "it starts it. Crowther's inventions explain the phantoms, but not the poison. Tell me, Mr. Hartley, did you enter this room last night after your cousin retired?" Hartley flushed. "No, sir, I remained in my chamber, as Mrs. Greeley will verify." Holmes's look was like a sword, yet someone did. The key was recovered in the lock within. However, the front door exhibits traces of tampering. If Crowther came via stealth, he may have gained this chamber as well. However, one detail concerns me. The poison chosen was strychnine, which requires knowledge rather than impulse. Crowther is a bitter partner, but is he a chemist? Hartley faltered. I cannot say." Holmes turned away abruptly. "Watson, we must go over Crowther's history. Let us not forget that in such partnerships, one man contributes capital and the other skill. Crowther may still possess the knowledge, or he may not. Until we know which, the net cannot be drawn." Lestrade, impatient as ever, insisted on removing Crowther to the yard, and Holmes did not object. Yet I could see my friend's thinking was far from content. He prowled the corridors of Fern Lodge that evening, like a dog restless at the scent, but not yet in sight of its target. Holmes barely touched his food at supper, which Mrs. Greeley insisted on in spite of the sadness in the house. His gaze moved constantly to the door, as though expecting some intrusion. When we finally returned to the drawing room, he spoke in a low voice, trembling with restrained energy. "Watson, the case is all about access. Who has access to Ainsworth's glass, and who can manipulate the scene to suggest supernatural interference? Crowther has the purpose of revenge, and we have him in the act of spectral trickery. But the poison has another hand. Think of the transparency bonded with balsam, The resin applied on the sash, the neatness of the preparations. Crowther may have renewed the idea, but was it originally his? Ursui. He broke off, peering into the fire, his profile cut sharp against the brightness. He stayed still for some minutes before springing to his feet. That's enough, Watson. Tomorrow we will see Mr. Crowther at the yard. I would hear his story before the magistrate does. Until then, watch your sleep, since the next turn of this enterprise will not leave us inactive. I confess that I lay up all night, listening to the house creaks and the wind sighing in the chimneys. The answer to Percival Ainsworth's death was hidden somewhere in its silent heart, and I knew Holmes would extract it, even if it meant giving up every hour of sleep. The next morning brought dismal skies and dripping eaves, the type of London day that seems to dampen not only the cobbles, but also the spirits of all who walk them. However, Holmes was brisk, even energetic, as we took a hansom to Scotland Yard. His eyes had a piercing brilliance that betrayed his lack of sleep, despite the fact that the rest of him appeared taut and ready as a drawn bow. At the yard, we were brought down a corridor smelling faintly of ink, damp wool and tobacco smoke. Lestrade awaited us outside the holding rooms, his countenance that of a man both satisfied and concerned, for he clearly wished Holmes to support the arrest of Crowther as final. "You'll find him sullen," Lestrade said as we walked in. "He hasn't spoken since last night except to curse, but I dare say he'll find his tongue when he sees you, Holmes." Crowther sat on a bench, wrists manacled, and heavy coat removed. His sturdy physique had lost its bravado. He appeared shrunken, but the eyes behind his brows remained harsh and bitter. Holmes sat opposite him, folding his long legs with ease that contrasted with the prisoner's uncomfortable size. "Mr. Crowther," he began in that disarmingly quiet voice of his, "you must realize that silence will not serve you. The cable, lantern slide, and resin provide conclusive evidence of your trespass. You have no way of denying it," Crowther sneered. "So why bother questioning me?" "Because, sir, the law may be fine with half the truth, but I am not. You created phantoms, yes, but I don't think you poisoned Percival Ainsworth. That required more in-depth information and access that you did not have. If you do not speak, the hangman may still summon you on a charge higher than burglary. If you do, you may be able to escape the noose. The choice is yours." Crowther's defiance weakened briefly. His attention moved to me and then back to Holmes. "What do you want?" "Are your account without omission of your dealings with Ainsworth these past weeks?" observed Holmes. The man took a long breath. "I despised him, that's true. He wrecked me in Chancery, leaving me almost penniless. He let me out of contracts that were half mine. So yes, I visited his house. I intended to scare him, to make up for the nights he left me staring at bare walls while he profited handsomely. I was aware of his experiments with lanterns and slides. We had previously discussed demonstrating such tricks to investors. I took one of his transparencies, rigged a line, and showed his servants a ghost. But kill him? No, I never touched his glass or set foot in that workshop. I swear it." Holmes's eyes never left the man's face. "And yet you arrived loaded with resin and cord, ready to manipulate locks." "If you had gained entrance, I never did," Crowther burst out. The door was shut and the windows were latched. "I only intended to disturb the household and make them believe the place was haunted. I wanted him afraid, not dead, and when I crept upon the roof I saw no light in his room. If he died, it was by another's hand, not mine." There was a ring of truth in his tone, and I saw Holmes lean back, his long fingers steepled. "You may not have killed him," he said softly, "but you have shown us that another must have done so. Tell me, who else knew of these contrivances?" Crowther hesitated, then muttered, "Hartley. He was curious. Asked me once about the slides. He fancied himself clever, but he had no stomach for the work." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Thank you, Mr. Crowther, you have told me enough." Outside the room, Lestrade grumbled. "The man admits to the phantoms, and still you hunt for shadows. Hartley now. He is but a gentleman lodger." "Gentleman or not," Holmes said sharply, "he alone had access at the crucial hour. Remember, Crowther entered by stealth from without, but someone within placed the poisoned draught before Ainsworth. Hartley quarrelled with him. Hartley had free movement about the house, and Hartley knew, through Crowther or otherwise, of the lantern tricks. The two threads may have twined together. We returned to Baker Street by afternoon, Holmes refusing to leave matters to Lestrade alone. There he spread the notes and scraps taken from Ainsworth's workroom across the table. I watched as his keen gaze flicked from one to another, then at last fixed upon a small notebook bound in worn calf. He opened it, ran a finger down the page, and gave a cry of satisfaction. "Watson, look here. These are not railway calculations, but formulas, mixtures of balsam, resin, turpentine. And here, strychnose extract diluted with spirits, written in his own hand. He had been experimenting with poisons, perhaps to test preservation of slides. But see this note, Hartley requests sample. Watson, do you grasp the import? The poison was in the house not by accident, but by invitation." I stared at the page, a chill running down my spine. Then Hartley had only to slip it into his cousin's glass under cover of the night. And Crowther's phantoms provided the perfect distraction. Precisely. Holmes snapped the book shut. Crowther's hatred provided the diversion, but Hartley's ambition supplied the hand of death. A more diabolical partnership of accident and design I have rarely encountered. That evening Holmes wrote swiftly, sending notes to Lestrade and to Mrs. Ainsworth, requesting Hartley's presence at Baker Street under the guise of discussing her late husband's affairs. He sealed the letter with a decisive press. "Tomorrow, Watson," he said, "the mask will be torn away. Hartley has walked among us in borrowed mourning, feigning grief while calculating gain. He thinks Crowther's arrest secures his safety. But when he sits in that chair across from me, the truth will weigh heavier than any disguise he has yet worn." His eyes glittered with anticipation, and I felt again that peculiar mixture of awe and unease that always overcame me when Holmes prepared to spring the final trap. The following afternoon, the sitting room at Baker Street was prepared with that curious air of theatre which Holmes could summon at will. The curtains were half drawn against the pale light, the fire glowed at just the right pitch, and every object upon the table was placed with a precision that suggested design. Among them lay Ainsworth's notebook, the mahogany case of optical instruments, and a glass half filled with water, into which Holmes had dropped a few grains of harmless quinine to imitate the bitterness of strychnine. He paced the room with restless energy until at last the bell announced our visitor. Lionel Hartley entered with a show of composure, though his pallor betrayed a sleepless night. He bowed to Holmes and to me, speaking with that smooth courtesy that had first recommended him to Mrs. Ainsworth's hospitality. Yet his eyes darted uneasily to the articles on the table. "You sent for me, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I came out of duty to my cousin, though I confess I know little of her husband's affairs." Holmes motioned him to the armchair opposite the fire. "On the contrary, sir, you know more than you admit. We are here to discuss not merely Mr. Ainsworth's business, but the circumstances of his death. A frank word from you may prevent the necessity of harsher measures." Hartley stiffened. "If this is another accusation, I must protest. The police have already arrested the man responsible." Holmes's lips curved in that thin smile which so often preceded revelation. "Ah, Crowther. Yes, he was arrested for climbing roofs and frightening maids. But tell me, Mr. Hartley, how came strychnine into your cousin's glass?" "Crowther denies it, and his denial bears the stamp of truth. Yet the poison was there, cunningly disguised, and you, sir, were the one man within the house who could have placed it." Hartley's hands gripped the arms of the chair, but his voice remained controlled. "This is monstrous. I had no knowledge of strychnine, nor would I stoop to such villainy." Holmes opened the notebook and turned it toward him. "Do you deny this entry? Hartley requests sample," written in Ainsworth's own hand. He had been experimenting with chemicals for his optical work. "You asked for a portion and you used it. The lantern slides and resin may have been Crowther's mischief, but the poison was yours." The man's composure faltered. He leaned forward, staring at the page as if to will it into falsehood. He misinterpreted. I asked only about balsam for mounting slides. If he wrote my name beside strychnose, it was his error." Holmes's voice hardened. "Error does not pour bitterness into a glass at midnight. Error does not profit by a cousin's death. Tell me, what did you hope to gain? A loan refused yesterday, inheritance tomorrow. Such calculations are the refuge of desperate men. Confess, and you may yet find mercy." Hartley's eyes flickered wildly toward me, as though seeking sympathy, but I could not disguise my abhorrence. He rose suddenly, one hand pressed to his brow. "You have no proof. Words, notebooks, suspicions, nothing more. You cannot drag a gentleman's honor through the mire on such flimsy grounds." Holmes's hand shot out, seizing the glass of quinine. He thrust it before Hartley's face. "And yet, sir, you know the taste. Last night you disguised it with spirits." Drink now if you are innocent." Hartley recoiled as though struck. His lips moved soundlessly, then closed tight. Holmes set the glass down with calm finality. "Your silence condemns you more than words. But do not mistake me. We seek justice, not melodrama. Inspector Lestrade will join us shortly, and I trust you will be more explicit in your statement when confronted with the law." The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the faint rattle of a hansom in the street below. At last Hartley slumped back into the chair, his bravado dissolved. "Yes," he muttered hoarsely, "I put it in his glass. I thought it would look like apoplexy. I thought no one would suspect. Crowther's tricks were a gift from Providence. I had only to let suspicion fall where it wished. Percival was a tyrant to me, as he was to others. I deserved my chance." "Your chance at ruin," Holmes said coldly. "Murder never grants prosperity. It grants only the rope. You may console yourself that your accomplice of circumstance, Crowther, will be charged with lesser crimes, but your own part is black indeed." Hartley buried his face in his hands. I could scarcely look upon him, so complete was the collapse of the man who had entered with an air of injured dignity not an hour before. Holmes, however, betrayed neither triumph nor pity. He resumed his pacing, hands behind his back, as though the confession were but another piece upon his mental chessboard. At that moment, Lestrade entered, his keen eyes taking in the scene at once. "Well, well, I see you've done it again, Holmes." "The gentleman's face tells the story." Holmes tilted his head. "You will find the written confession in due time, Inspector. For the present, I believe you have sufficient grounds for arrest." Lestrade advanced, producing the necessary warrant. Hartley rose with a kind of mechanical obedience, his voice dull. "I will go. There is nothing more to say." When the door closed upon them, I turned to Holmes. "You pressed him hard, my dear fellow. But without that notebook, without Crowther's testimony, you might never have unmasked him." Holmes shrugged. "It is often so, Watson. Murderers entangle themselves with accomplices they despise, forgetting that one witness can unravel the whole." Hartley believed the phantom would suffice to cloak his crime, but he forgot that science leaves its signature upon every act. Resin, cord, strychnine, all write their own testimony. My task is only to read it. I could not suppress a shudder at the recollection of the ghastly face at the window. And Crowther? He will answer for his trespass and trickery, but he did not kill. He will leave the dock alive. Whether he will prosper, I cannot say. As for Mrs. Ainsworth, she will have her peace at last, though dearly bought. Holmes sank into his chair, the firelight glinting upon his sharp profile. For a moment he was silent. Then he added with a sudden weariness, "It is the old story, Watson, greed and resentment cloaked in spectacle. A man will kill for gain, but he prefers the world to think death came by accident. It is our role to strip away illusion, though I sometimes wonder whether mankind values its illusions more dearly than the truth." He closed his eyes. The energy of the hunt at last expended, and I sat in silence, marveling once again at the strange blend of genius and melancholy that made Sherlock Holmes at once the most brilliant and the most enigmatic of men. The following day was a subdued one. The air in Baker Street seemed almost heavy after the exertions of the past nights, and Holmes himself moved with a languor that belied the quicksilver brilliance he had displayed before Hartley's confession. He sat for much of the morning in his armchair, fingers steepled, eyes closed, the blue smoke of his pipe wreathing about him like some half-formed problem, refusing to be dispelled. For myself, I busied my pen with the task of arranging my notes, yet even as I wrote, I could not help but glance at Holmes and wonder at his silence. The case seemed concluded. Hartley had confessed. Crowther's role as accomplice was plain. The poison had been identified beyond doubt. And yet, something in my friend's stillness suggested incompletion, as though he felt some part of the tapestry yet unexamined. It was near midday when Lestrade arrived, rubbing his gloved hands together against the cold. His expression was one of satisfaction, tempered by puzzlement. "Well, gentlemen, Hartley has put it down in writing just as you said, Holmes. Signed confession, every word of it. Crowther, too, has admitted his trespass and will face the magistrate. All neatly tied up." Holmes opened one eye. "Neatly, Inspector. You flatter the truth. Confessions are the easiest of knots. They untie themselves if not reinforced. Hartley has admitted guilt, yes, but we must confirm whether he acted alone. The draft, the glass, the preparations all bear inquiry still. Lestrade shifted uneasily. Surely, Holmes, a written confession is enough. Holmes sat forward suddenly, the fire lighting his angular features. Enough for a court, perhaps, but not for me. I have learned long ago never to rest upon the word of a desperate man. He may tell part of the truth, hoping the rest will remain buried. No, Inspector, I must revisit Fern Lodge once more, for there is a detail gnawing at me still. Though Lestrade groaned audibly, I was not surprised. That evening we rode again to Hampstead, where the house wore its mourning more openly than before. Heavy blinds covered the windows, and the few lights that glowed within seemed weak, as though dulled by sorrow. Mrs. Ainsworth received us with quiet composure, though her eyes were ringed with grief. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "I heard from Inspector Lestrade of Lionel's confession. It has broken me afresh. To think that one of my own blood—" Her voice faltered, but she steadied herself. "I thank you, nevertheless, for bringing light to what was shrouded." Holmes inclined his head not unkindly. "Madam, I must trespass once more upon your patience. There is a matter of detail that troubles me. You said on the morning of discovery that your husband's hand was clenched about his pen, and that a blot of ink marred the page. Yes, it was as though he had been writing and was struck down mid-line. Precisely. Yet when I examined the page, the star-shaped blot bore no word beside it. If Hartley had poisoned him in the night, why should he sit with pen in hand at dawn? Unless— Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he turned abruptly toward the workroom. We followed him within. The air was still tainted faintly with varnish and spirits. Holmes bent over the writing desk and spread the pages once more. Then he lifted the blotter, examined the underside, and gave a low exclamation. "Here, Watson, look. The impression of words pressed through the paper. Our engineer was writing when death overtook him. And what he wrote was not idle." I held the blotter to the light. Faint but legible were the words, The remainder trailed into a scrawl. "Hartley poisoned me," I whispered. "Just so," Holmes said, his voice like steel. "The dead man himself accuses. It is the final link, Watson. The proof that the draft was taken knowingly from his cousin's hand. Hartley must have brought it under pretense of reconciliation. Percival drank, suspecting nothing. But with his last strength he seized the pen to record his suspicion. His hand failed him before the word was done. Lestrade stared open-mouthed. By George, Holmes, you've sealed it now. No jury will doubt when the victim himself left the name. Holmes replaced the blotter gently, almost reverently. There is no satisfaction in such discoveries, Inspector. They speak too plainly of human frailty. Still, truth must be known. And with this the matter is indeed complete. Mrs. Ainsworth, who had lingered at the door, pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Then my husband did not die in vain, she murmured. He spoke even as he left me. Holmes turned to her, his voice softened. He spoke, madam, and he has been heard. Justice will follow. We departed soon after, leaving the house to its mourning. As we rode back through the fog-bound streets, I reflected upon the strange symmetry of the case. Crowther's grotesque apparitions distracting the household, while within, a quieter but deadlier treachery unfolded. It was a pattern of deceit layered upon deceit, until only Holmes's keen eye could separate truth from illusion. Holmes himself remained silent during the journey, gazing out into the mist. Only when we reached Baker Street did he speak. You see, Watson, how men deceive themselves as much as others. Hartley believed the ghostly trick would cover his crime, while Crowther thought his phantom would avenge his pride without blood. In the end, each served as the other's disguise, and each betrayed himself by that very device. The one by poison, the other by rope and resin. It is ever so. Falsehoods entwine until the truth, patient and persistent, forces its way through. I could only nod, struck anew by the cold clarity of his reasoning. Yet as Holmes sank once more into his chair, fingers steepled, eyes half closed, I wondered whether even he felt the shadow that lingered. For though the culprit was unmasked and the law would have its due, Fern Lodge would never again be free of that dreadful memory. The face at the window at dawn, and the pen that scrawled a dying man's last truth. The days that followed passed in a curious mixture of resolution and lingering unease. The newspapers, ever hungry for sensation, carried lurid accounts of the face in the window at dawn, some describing spectral visitations and others praising the police for swift arrests. Holmes, who never read his own praise with anything but contempt, pushed the papers aside with the back of his hand, declaring that ink is a poor solvent for error. Yet I could see even he was not entirely free of the case's shadow. His violin remained untouched in its corner, and more than once I found him staring fixedly into the fire, as though still tracing invisible lines of deduction upon the flames. Lestrade called one evening with official thanks, bringing word that Hartley was remanded for trial on a full charge of murder. Crowther, by contrast, would face a lesser charge of burglary and malicious mischief, his contrivances having proved grotesque but not deadly. The inspector was jubilant, confident the Crown's case would hold. With the confession, the poison and the dead man's blotter, "It's as tight as a sailor's knot," he declared. Holmes, however, only raised his brows. "Do not be too sure, Inspector. Knots are tied to be untied. Hartley's counsel may claim coercion, or that the blotter's marks are mere coincidence. You must remember that juries are swayed as much by theatre as by fact. I advise you to keep Crowther under close watch, for though his guilt lies elsewhere, his testimony may prove essential. A man embittered may speak truth more freely than one who courts pity." After Lestrade's departure, I ventured to ask Holmes whether he truly doubted the outcome. He leaned back, his thin face illuminated by the lamp's glow. "No, Watson, the truth will prevail. But it is a lesson. Never imagine that the law is the same as justice. Our task is to uncover facts. What men do with them is another matter entirely." It was 2 mornings later when a message arrived by special delivery, carried on thick paper and sealed with a black crest. It was from Mrs. Ainsworth. She requested that Holmes visit Fern Lodge once more, as she had discovered among her late husband's effects a sealed envelope addressed in a trembling hand to "My beloved wife, to be opened only if I should not live." She dared not read it alone. Holmes agreed without hesitation, and I accompanied him. The house was quieter now, the blinds half drawn, and the servants moving about with the subdued tread of those who inhabit a house of mourning. Mrs. Ainsworth met us in the drawing-room, pale but resolute. She held out the envelope with fingers that shook only slightly. Holmes received it with a bow, examined the seal, and then handed it to her. "Madam, it is yours to open. We shall bear witness if you wish." She broke the seal and unfolded the sheet within. Her lips moved as she read. Then she pressed a hand to her breast and handed the paper to me. I read aloud in a steady voice, though the words themselves trembled. "My dearest Beatrice, if you should ever open this, know that I felt danger close upon me. Lionel has pressed me for money beyond what I can give. He grows desperate. Tonight I take a glass prepared by his hand, though I suspect its bitterness. If it proves fatal, remember that I loved you and that I die warning you against him. Yours, Percival." For a long moment the room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Ainsworth bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. Holmes replaced the letter gently upon the table. "It is as I feared," he said softly. "The blotter gave us fragments. The letter gives us certainty. Your husband's last thought was to shield you. This, madam, will silence even the boldest advocate." She looked up through her tears. "Then the world will know the truth. That is all I ask." Holmes inclined his head gravely. We remained only long enough to assure her that the letter would be placed securely in Lestrade's keeping, and then we departed. As we rode back through the greying streets, I could not help but marvel at the layers of foresight that had preserved the truth. The blotter's impression, the dying man's last effort with his pen, and the letter entrusted to his wife. It was as though Percival Ainsworth had fought even in death to unmask his betrayer. Holmes seemed lost in his own reflections, speaking only once, and then with that mixture of brilliance and melancholy I had come to know so well. "Watson, men labor their whole lives to build machines, bridges, and railways, yet it is in their frailties that they leave their most indelible marks." Ainsworth, with all his calculations, could not guard himself against the treachery of his own blood, and yet with his last strength he left a line of ink that outlived him and condemned his murderer. Strange, is it not, that the most delicate thread can bind more surely than the stoutest rope? In the weeks that followed, the case passed into the machinery of the courts. Hartley stood trial, his smoothness gone, his features worn by confinement and fear. Crowther gave testimony, grudging but damning, recounting how Hartley had pried into Ainsworth's experiments and demanded samples under the guise of curiosity. The letter read aloud in court silenced even the boldest defense. The jury returned their verdict without hesitation, and justice, at least as the law defines it, was done. When I remarked one evening that the case had ended more completely than most, Holmes gave a dry laugh. Completely? No, Watson. A man is dead, a woman bereaved, 2 others ruined. That is not completion. It is consequence. What we call resolution is but the point at which our interference ceases. Life goes on for those who remain, and not always more happily. He turned back to his chemical retorts, yet I saw in his eyes that distant fire, the unquenchable hunger for problems yet unsolved. For all his cold words, I knew the case had touched him. Perhaps it was the image of the dying man's unfinished scrawl. Perhaps the memory of that ghastly phantom at the window, or perhaps only the melancholy knowledge that truth once revealed rarely brings comfort. Thus ended the affair of the face in the window at dawn, a case that to my mind exemplified both the ingenuity of crime and the inexorable power of deduction. If ever proof were needed that no mask of illusion, however cleverly contrived, can long withstand the gaze of Sherlock Holmes, this was it. And yet, as I set down the last of my notes, I found myself shuddering still at the recollection of that pale apparition pressed against the nursery glass, and at the thought of a dying hand scratching one final, unfinished word in the silence of a locked room. The conclusion of the matter came some weeks later, when spring began to touch London with the faintest warmth, and the memory of the cold Hampstead mornings seemed distant. Holmes and I sat together at Baker Street, he with his violin across his knees, I with my notes compiled, when I asked him at last whether the case of the face in the window at dawn satisfied him as one of his more complete victories. He drew the bow across the strings, producing a low contemplative chord before replying. Victories, Watson, are for soldiers. For me there are only problems stated and problems resolved. This one was curious and in its curiosity instructive, but I take no pride in the downfall of Hartley, nor in the exposure of Crowther's pitiful devices. If anything, I pity them both. One sought revenge through childish theatre, the other sought gain through murder, and between them they contrived a pantomime so grotesque that it might have deceived many a sensible man. Yet all the while the truth lay in the ink upon a page and the chemistry of a draught. I reminded him that justice had been served, that Mrs. Ainsworth was free of deceit, and that Crowther, though disgraced, had been spared the worst. Surely that was worth some satisfaction. Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes distant. Satisfaction, yes, but also reflection. You see, Watson, the human imagination is both ally and enemy. It gave Crowther the means to terrify, Hartley the nerve to conceal, and poor Ainsworth the foresight to warn. Imagination may devise ghosts, but it may also leave behind the simplest, most damning mark, a name half written, a blot pressed through a sheet. Illusion is but a curtain. Truth, though faint, shines through it if one looks steadily. He played a brighter phrase upon the violin, as though to dispel the heaviness of his words. Remember that, my dear fellow, when you set your pen to record this affair. Let the world marvel at the phantom in the nursery window if it must, but ensure it also understands the greater lesson, that crime, however cloaked in superstition, is wrought by human hands, and can be unmasked by human reason. And so it was that I set down the record of the case of the face in the window at dawn. To the public, it became another tale of Holmes's uncanny insight and the exposure of villainy. To me it was more, a reminder of the fragility of trust, the tenacity of truth, and the strange theatre of crime where shadow and substance entwine. And above all, it was another chapter in the extraordinary chronicle of the man who was, and remains, the most singular and brilliant companion of my life, Sherlock Holmes.